Okay, welcome back to Artificial Intelligence Research. Today we're talking with Justin. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself before we start?
I'm Justin. I'm a recent college graduate from Hopkins year 2021, and I'm currently working as a software engineer at a university affiliated research center, mainly in the area of missile defense. So,
Wow,
yeah.
that's actually pretty cool.
Well,
Uh,
sounds cool, but when you get down to the weeds,
I see.
but that's with every field. But yeah.
Okay, so the series is based on artificial intelligence. And what prior experience do you have with artificial intelligence? Has it been a part of your job or any classes you've taken?
So during my undergrad, I was a computer science and applied mathematics major, and my primary area of focus in both of those was in AI, more specifically machine learning, which is a subset of AI that mainly has to do with learning patterns from data, whether that be small data sets, large data sets, big data. So that's my undergraduate experience. And as for any of my experience using AI and ML at work, some of it I did use during specific projects, mainly having to do with uh, multi-distributional, probability distributional Kalman filters. And Kalman filters are uh, essentially ways of tracking based on the physical model that you have, along with live stream data. And you can think of them as essentially just Bayesian chains for that are used for, well, tracking any sort of physical process or model.
Huh, interesting. Um, cool. Uh, I guess moving on to the questions. What do you think the strengths and weaknesses of artificial intelligence are?
That is a that is a very a very broad problem, broad question asking about the strengths and weaknesses of AI. Do you have any like specific examples? For example, one weakness you could say of a specific field of MI, machine learning, is the amount of data that is required. One example of this sort of weakness being in play is that in the financial industry, you hear of AI and ML being touted as the new sort of wonder weapon that can sort of predict the stock market, produce thousands and produce like huge returns compared to traditional analysts. But in that case, you haven't really been seeing that happen as much as since the vast majority of AI and ML being used in the financial industry is just linear regression, whereas other methods aren't used, such as neural networks, clustering. And the reason for that is because of the core weaknesses of machine learning. This one specific field of AI is that requires a high amount of data. And one example of data not being sufficient is that there's only been around 250 years of stock market yearly returns. And in terms of AI machine learning, 250 data points is just not enough. So that is one of the weaknesses you could say in MI and AI and ML, in that if you're trying to apply AI and ML to a specific field that simply doesn't have enough data points, you won't get very far. Of course, the strengths of this is that we live in a world where data is becoming ever more ubiquitous, especially since that on the internet, for example, everything, web traffic, log traffic, and everything, even machines that we use, engineering systems, they all log some sort of data that can be used in the AI and ML purposes. So data can be the biggest strength and weakness of AI and ML systems.
Ah, I see.
But aside from that, you might have to be a bit more specific in like sort of the advantages and disadvantages AI for use in what fields. Like might need to be a bit more specific when asking about that.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't realize how much data it actually needed. But
Right.
when you mentioned how like after 250 years,
That is one
uh,
example. That's one example in which AI and ML hasn't really seen, or it sees a lot of use, but it hasn't been like the magical wondrous bullet that you see in other problems, such as machine vision. For example, I'm sure you've all heard about how neural networks are really good at recognizing certain images, right? And one of the reasons for that is that these neural networks, they require huge data sets with thousands and thousands of examples. Well, it just so happens to turn out that we have thousands and thousands of test images that you can feed a neural network.
mm,
I guess another example of a certain strength and weakness of AI and ML is that AI, especially ML at its core, is I'm going to be talking a lot about machine learning since a lot of my focus during undergraduate was on machine learning. AI includes other topics such as like reinforcement learning, Q learning, but my main focus was on learning patterns via data, machine learning specifically. And one example of another weakness to answer your question is that machine learning in general attempts to find patterns in data. And intuitively, you can understand and see which sort of problems that this would be really good for. If you're a person, you might see a picture of a dog and you might not be able to explain why you know it's a dog, but you can tell when a dog is a dog. In other words, there's some sort of underlying pattern within it. And what machine learning is really good at is taking in data that represents these pictures of dogs and finding these underlying patterns. But if you're in a problem space where you're not exactly sure whether or not there is a pattern, for example, predicting the stock market, that is notoriously difficult. Even say the best hedge fund managers don't really outperform the market. You can look at the market returns and you wouldn't exactly know what sort of pattern there is. You couldn't tell whether or not some sort of whether the market will go up or go down day to day. You can't really see any indication that there is a pattern, and that's also one of the reasons why AI ML tools for predicting market movements has not really kicked off or has not really seen that much success. So one of the weaknesses specifically in ML is that if there does not seem to be a discernible pattern or any sort of rhyme or reason to it, it might be difficult for ML to specifically find that pattern. If a pattern doesn't exist, then, well, machine learning will find it pretty difficult to find a pattern. It might find spurious patterns, but again, that's not something you'd really want for a successful ML model.
yeah, okay. Wow, those are very detailed explanations. Um, I've also heard like stories of like sort of biased data sets leading to like biased AI, sort of like,
Oh, definitely. I think the canonical example is unbalanced data sets. For example, imagine if you had a disease, right? A
mm,
disease which only affected a very small proportion of people, right? And you had a data set that had a bunch of features in it, such as, I don't know, blood pressure levels, cholesterol levels. But if your if your data set is entirely unbalanced, where you'd only have like say, I don't know, 99 examples of somebody not having the disease and one example of somebody actually having the disease, well, your data set could simply output a result that says your patient does not have the disease 100% of the time, and they would be correct 99% of the time,
mm.
which is one that's the canonical example of unbalanced data sets.
Yeah, I've also heard like um racial biases in certain AI databases, but I guess you've already
Yes.
covered most of like the biases part.
I believe on the news that there was this one example that this court, I don't recall the exact details, but this judge or this court was using a AI ML model to determine whether or not to allow bail for certain uh, prisoners. And it turns out that the AI and ML model was heavily biased against minorities more often than not, just simply not allowing them bail despite certain factors, such as whether or not they were prior offenders, their socioeconomic level, whether or not the crime was violent. So
Mm.
I think that was on the news recently.
Oh, wow. Uh, wait, I lost my train of thought. Oh, wait. Yeah. So obviously machine learning and AI need like tons of data. For certain types of AI, for example, like facial recognition, do you think that it's a privacy concern to like take that data and use it? And do you also think it's like reasonable for AI facial recognition to be used in like security or things like that?
That's a really tough ethical question. I think the underlying issue is that technology in general is just advancing at a far greater rate than which we can really develop laws for. Like socially, we are not advancing as fast as the technology that we're developing. And AI and ML is a special problem with, like, that's a special example of that, especially facial recognition. There, there people do make arguments that facial recognition and storing that data does lead to, say, better security measures such as like fraud detection, identity theft. But at the same time, there are a lot of bad actors. Well, maybe not even bad actors, but governments that can use that technology in pretty horrendous ways to, say, oppress large portions of the population. So, that's a tough question. In my personal opinion, I I wouldn't say that the technology inherently is a bad thing. It's mainly how, as cliche as it sounds, how we use it, and therefore a lot of attention is being placed on like how to do things, such as like how do we get an AI or ML model to sort of recognize people in general, but a lot less attention is being placed on, okay, but what are the limits? Like, how do we regulate this? And which is what I believe that something is deserves just as much attention as actually developing the technology.
Yeah. I guess one thing that's concerning, I guess, or I don't necessarily, in my opinion, I wouldn't necessarily trust like companies, especially with this kind of data, because we all know how much they like
Yeah,
harvest
I mean,
data for like advertisements and whatnot. But
you could make the argument that companies can be even worse than governments because governments, regardless of whether or not they're total democracies or dictatorships, they need to still have the support of some people, whereas companies are entirely profit driven.
yeah. All right. So one question, I guess, what do you think a lot of people misunderstand about AI?
Well, generally speaking, most people seem to misunderstand that AI is some sort of cure-all or panacea for like any sort of problem that they have. I guess one issue that you see a lot these days in startups or in companies in general is that you see a lot of them advertising about how they used the most advanced cutting edge AI or machine learning to solve some sort of problem that has been ongoing so far and so on. And in a lot of the cases, it turns out that it just simply that sort of AI ML just doesn't really work. One of
Hmm.
the biggest examples is that I talk a lot about the finance industry, but that's just because I have a passing interest in it. But generally speaking, 90% of the AI and ML models used in the finance industry, regardless of what the investors or stakeholders like to tell you, a lot of it is mainly just linear regression, logistic regression, or some form of regression. And don't get me wrong, these are definitely considered AI or ML, but they're not what most people think of when you mention cutting edge AI ML tactics that can somehow become some sort of general intelligence that can solve all your problems, all your business problems, or figure out all sorts of information that you need.
I
So
see.
that's one big misunderstanding. Uh,
Could you explain like the difference between the two?
between AI and ML.
No, the regression and ML or whatever.
So, well, I mean, linear regression is technically considered part of machine learning. Is that what you're asking? What the difference
Oh,
between ML and
or
linear
like the
regression?
difference between like the two sort of cutting edge part and the more common part you mentioned.
So, uh, when people talk about cutting edge AI and ML, and they're usually talking about neural networks, right? That's what you hear on news all the time. We use neural networks to do so and so, and neural networks are definitely cutting edge. Or they might talk about something like random forests, basically, essentially incredibly complex ML and AI models that are both not very explainable and not very interpretable. And some people view them as tools that can solve pretty much any problem, right? And in some cases, they're right. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these models and tools, what they're really trying to do is model some sort of objective function, some sort of like mathematical function, or they're trying to optimize such a function. And these ML and AI models all really just try to either optimize some sort of function or try to solve some sort of function. These functions tend to be something such as loss functions, a loss function being a representation of like how good or how badly you're solving a problem. And it just happens to be the case like in 99% of the problems that you encounter in day to day that you'd want to use AI and ML, a linear regression or logistic regression works just fine.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that's a good enough explanation when I'm talking about cutting edge AI ML models.
Yeah, I think we understand. Um, I guess it's sort of a similar topic, and you already mentioned how much data it requires. But
Well,
what do you think?
certain AI ML models definitely require a lot of data, such as uh, neural networks. I know, well, when I talk about data, I'm really talking a lot more about machine learning models, but there are definitely AI strategies such as reinforcement learning and Q-learning that don't rely on data per se, but they do have access to something called a search space. And from that search space, they can explore, get sort of inputs, sort of like results, and from there develop strategies. But I can't say that I'm too familiar with sort of non-machine learning, non-data reliant AI models.
Ah, yeah. So outside of or I guess what what's the hardest part of developing AI, do you think? And if you think it's the data part, then could you give us like more aspects that are hard?
Well, since you mentioned the data part, I can tell you right now that actually running the model isn't as difficult as since there are all sorts of open source packages in Python and R and MATLAB that allow you to plug in, chug in data and get a model out. Uh, in fact, there's even a lot of open source packages that not only let you do run the actual model, but they can also allow you to do things such as like cross validation, splitting your data set up, all that stuff. The most difficult part in ML, for example, is really just getting that clean data set to begin with, right? It's not every day. It's actually pretty rare that you'll ever get like a data set which is very cleanly generated, as in you have your very much your clean dependent y variables that are some specific value within a specific range, and then you have your x variables, which are like your feature spaces. A lot of times in the real world, when you're trying to get data, you'd find that a lot of the data needs cleaning. You'd have values that are numbers, or the numbers but spelled differently, or they're sometimes misspelled, or they're misinputted, or you might find certain data categories that just simply don't play well and need to be transformed in some way. One example is categorical variables in AI and ML models. ML models don't do very well with categorical variables. Categorical being something like, what color is it? Blue, red, yellow, green, and you'd have to do a lot of transformations to get that into a form that a AI and ML model could actually read. Usually do some sort
Mm,
of like encoding, such as you could have 5 different variables for 5 different colors, and the values for that variable is 1 if they're that color. So really data munging and data cleaning is a really difficult part when trying to do anything AI and ML related. Well, specifically anything AI and ML related that requires a data set, which usually means that you're doing problems such as classification or prediction.
right, I see. Um, let's talk about the future of AI. I guess what's one thing you're excited to see be developed?
So, this is gonna come out a bit left field, but have you ever heard of the field of connectomics?
Um, no, I've never heard that term.
So, connectomics really has to do with sort of essentially making a computer model of a human brain. So stepping into neural networks, I think everyone at this point knows that one of the most cutting edge AI and ML models, neural networks, were developed with inspiration of how neurons work. Neurons being interconnected, receiving in input, running through the entire neural network, and so on and so on. And it's kind of intuitive why we'd want to base our AI and ML models on neural networks. I mean, we have the human brain to see, and we see that, hey, we're pretty intelligent. What if we could make an AI ML model that's about as intelligent as us? And maybe the best way to do that is to make it operate like us, hence
Mm,
neural networks. Connectomics is the field where they essentially take a brain, for example, and they try to image and map the brain, specifically all the neurons, what they're connected to each other, and to what extent that they're connected. And in terms of the laboratory use, they actually take a brain, cut it into very thin slices, run it through some imaging processing, and well, create a map of the brain. And the idea is that this is getting to like sci-fi future territory, but and we're really
mhm.
far away from this. But if you're able to make a complete map of a human brain, surely the uses of that in generating an actual AI and ML model is would be incredible. One example I can think of is that in my workplace, actually, there is a group that is working on connectomics right now. And what they managed to successfully do is they managed to get this one specific nematode, I believe it's a nematode, or it's some sort of very primitive worm. And they
Mm.
were able to completely image its brain. They took its brain out, managed to cut it into thin enough slices and map out its neurons into a mathematical computational model. And they took this model and uploaded it into an actual robot. And well, you could essentially, and the robot would more or less operate intuitively how a nematode would operate. Of course, if you know anything about nematodes, you know that they're not the most advanced of creatures. They kind of just squirm around, reacting to input stimuli. And I saw a demonstration of it where they had a robot that had that nematode computational model brain uploaded into it, and well, it kind of did what you expect it to do, squirm around. And the reason I'm excited about this regarding the future is that in the future, if we're able to model more complex brains computationally, then who knows? Maybe we might even be close to general intelligence, but it's really hard to say.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. Yeah, it does sound promising or like a very, very interesting field. But
Well,
are there
I
any
say
like ethical
there
problems with
are
that?
there are quite a few. Like one, I know I talked to them and they said that one of their problems was that it's actually kind of hard to find human brains that they let you dice into little pieces. So
I
that's
can
one thing.
imagine.
But it so when I explained this, I simplified a lot of things because I'm no biologist. I'm not super knowledgeable on stuff like neurons, and I know that neurons operate a lot more they're a lot more complicated than just you have a node and they send signals to other nodes. For example, neurons can like send signals at varying intensities, and we still to this day don't really even know exactly how neurons work. So even if we were able to create a complete computational map of a brain, it's we still wouldn't know exactly how to model it even if we had a complete map, because we don't really know how neurons work completely either. But
Mm,
assuming that we did be quite a few ethical concerns in my mind, mainly being that if it's pretty close to a human brain, right? I wouldn't call it sentience, but like if it's a general intelligence, is it still considered a person or not?
mm,
So, but yeah, that's there's a lot of ethical concerns. But again, this is like connectomics and just to be very clear, but the technology that we need to be able to map very even a mouse brain, for example, much less a human brain, is like decades off. So
ah,
uh I'm in terms of ethical concerns, I'm just mainly throwing out hypotheticals. If we can map a human brain and create an actual computational model that behaved like a human brain, then we'd have to start worrying about issues such as, well, can you consider it a human? What makes a human? And thereon.
yeah,
And then there'd also be problems with how exactly could you what could you use it for, right? Like if with a general intelligence such as that, is it ethical to say to strap it onto, I don't know, an armed drone and just have it patrol an area 24/7, just drone striking people that it recognizes as threats? Is that ethical? We already have the UN, I think, recently already declared or made some sort of announcement saying that, hey, we should probably regulate killer robots. I don't know if you saw in the news recently, but Russia uh, showed in the news media essentially an autonomous robot with a very large gun attached to its top. So there's also an ethical concern. Should you allow general intelligent AI and ML models onto killer robots?
yeah. I see that. As with all like AI issues, I guess it's very
Right.
complex. Um, yeah. So theoretically, if they like develop that, um, mapping the brain completely, like, is that in the realm of those sci-fi scenes where like, or sci-fi situations where people like pay to have their brain uploaded into a robot so they can like live longer and stuff? Is that like similar at any?
Well, to be honest, I want to be especially careful because I feel like mentioning this whole connectomics thing and like talking about what it could do and what it couldn't has opened this entire can of worms as to something that sounds almost science fantasy than science fiction.
Mm,
But in terms of what you're talking about, whether or not if we create a full computational model of a human brain that performs essentially like how the biological version does, then I there's no reason for me to think otherwise that what you talk about might not come to pass. But of course,
mm,
that's all predicated on the assumption that we do such a thing, which is very far off, in my opinion.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the main ethical concerns of AI and ML models in general is really just how we use them. Mainly, like the data that, first of all, there's the data that we collect. Is it ethical to even collect this much data from other people or just the world in general? Like, is there such a thing as data privacy? And in terms of using that data into AI ML models, how much control should we exactly lend over to an AI or ML model? For example, should we be really using an AI and ML model to determine, say, prison sentences when there we have real world examples that AI and ML models are not infallible? I'm sure everyone has heard the story about how I believe MIT developed a Twitter chatbot that would basically read tweets and try to tweet itself. And it took a very short amount of time before it became incredibly racist, homophobic.
Oh wow.
You know, it learned from Twitter. The
That's
data
funny.
set the data set were Twitter tweets, and the data set was full of toxicity, so the Twitter chatbot learned how to be toxic. Do you really want to let something loose like that autonomously, especially when AI and ML models can run many times faster than what a human can?
That's quite an interesting story.
Right, and well,
Oh, it kind of reminds me of that story where like that Google employee like said that their AI was sentient or something. They're like, was it a chatbot? It was some sort of AI.
it's like
Did you
some
hear
sort
about
of
that?
chatbot. I heard about it. I didn't read too in depth into it, but I think it's a load of crock. We're nowhere near close to sentient general intelligence.
Mm,
Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of advanced research in natural language programming with natural language processing, which does make some pretty convincing chatbots. But is it sentient? I highly doubt it. Not to
right.
mention that his fellow coworkers have come out and just told him that not only is he just completely off his rocker, but like he's just kind of loony in general.
Wait, did they say that?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe he was fired too.
Oh,
Not, yeah, people thought that it was because he was like he apparently he had a history of poor behavior and misrepresenting Google's engineering projects. But regarding whether or not, but more specifically regarding whether or not that chatbot is sentient, that is
mm,
highly doubt it.
yeah, I would agree. But do you think that in the future AI could ever become sentient at all? And also, I know that's a very ethical, like, or philosophical, what does sentient
Well,
even mean? Because everybody has said that to me already. But yeah, do you
well,
think so?
personally, I mean, if you talk from just a pure physics standpoint, your brain is really just atoms and molecules
Mm,
constructed in a way to pass signals on to each other. There is no real reason why we can't create something synthetic like that, right? Like, don't get me wrong, the human body is a marvel of biological engineering. But if you think about it, it was really just created, generated through like millions of years of evolution. If you believe in evolution, if you don't, then I guess there's nothing really to discuss. But this was generated through random chance, natural selection. There's really no reason to believe that we can't create something synthetic. And since the brain is biological in nature, there's no reason to believe why we can't create a synthetic brain capable of sentience. That's my 2 cents. How far in the future that this would take, anyone's guess.
yeah. Actually, that's a pretty good point too. A lot of people have argued that they don't think it can be sentient because they're basically just learning from humans and never actually like making their own sort of soul or anything. But
I've
that
heard
is a
some
very good point.
I've heard some arguments about how like maybe there's a X factor, like a soul or something, but at this point you're really getting more into like the field of arguing about religion and philosophy. But from a
Mm,
pure physics standpoint, if you believe that your human body is just purely constructed from the laws of physics, then there's really no reason to believe why we can't create something synthetic just like it or better.
yeah. Hmm. You ever heard of or played Detroit Become Human?
Yes, I've heard about the game. I've seen gameplay of it.
Yeah, it's a very cool like sort of take on the situation. Do you think that do you think we'll ever reach a situation like that?
Well, again, this is getting really far into speculative territory. My main interest in AI and ML are really just machine learning models, such as like support vector machines, neural networks, all sorts of regressions, radio
Right.
basis functions. In terms of like artificial intelligence and the philosophical concerns, I don't really have too deep of an opinion as to whether or not something can or cannot happen. So all I can really say is that, well, if it's possible to create a synthetic human, then I suppose Detroit Become Human could also become possible.
Mm. Um, Wait, so I'm sure you've heard of, or you've heard lots of stories about like AI art. Do you think that one, would an art piece being made by an AI influence your opinion on that art? And two, I guess, do you think AI will ever be like creative? Or actually, that's sort of similar to the previous question. So you can just answer the first one.
Could you repeat that first question one more time?
Yeah. If you found out that an art piece was made by an AI, would it affect your opinion of the art piece and how?
Oh, well, I did hear a story about how some people weren't happy recently, how an AI art piece won like first place in some
Yeah.
context. I'm not really an artsy person in general. I enjoy my entertainment. If I'm entertained by something, I'm happy with it just as it is. But when
Mm,
it comes to like arts and entertainment, my bar isn't very high. If I see something and I like it, I don't really care who made it. It's really as simple as that for me. If I saw a painting, thought it was really nice, and learned that it wasn't actually a person that created it, it was an AI, I just think, oh wow, that's cool. The painting's cool, and it's pretty cool that an AI made it, but that's about it. Of
yeah.
course, if you were to ask me whether or not in, say, a contest, whether or not that should be allowed, that's a tough question. I'd have to think more about that because an AI or ML model that creates such an art piece generally has to learn from somewhere, right?
Hmm.
And that would basically involve taking images of actual art pieces and generating based off that data set. Like, is that really plagiarism, right? Well, I don't know if if you call it plagiarism when you're copying an artwork rather than a writing piece. But then again, like people get inspired by other people's art all the time and create something of their own. Maybe it might be similar. Is that can an AI do that? And you know, but that's it's kind of going beyond what I'd like to think about.
Yeah, I see. I was also, I was pretty conflicted about that. Because on one hand, I'm like, I do art outside of school and stuff. And on one hand, it's sort of discouraging or scary even to see like um, art created so easily by AI. But on the other hand, it's also still art, kind of.
Oh, I'm sure it's,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a symptom of the larger problem we're all hearing about how the great automation is coming, where jobs are being automated away by AI and ML and robotics and such. And I guess the artists are finally seeing that in action with their field.
Mm. Yeah, on that topic, what do you think that AI will eventually replace all the jobs, or what jobs couldn't AI replace?
I guess that really goes. It depends on how far you want to go into like the science fantasy part of how advanced can AI and ML really get. If you don't mind anything about time frames, for example, like you have an infinite time frame which you can consider that AI and ML can develop, then you could first make the assumption that we'd eventually get to an AI and ML that has general intelligence, like a synthetic human being. But at that point, and then you could make the argument that says, well, yeah, any jobs that a human can do, a synthetic human can do, right? And that's
Yeah.
still technically considered AI and ML. But if you want to like decrease the scope of that a bit, like rather than general intelligence, do you think just run of the mill? Well, I don't want to say run of the mill, but like non-general intelligence AI and ML models, would they replace all the jobs? I'd have to say no.
Mm.
As a software engineer, I can say firsthand that someone's going to have to write the software, and AI and ML models definitely do not write good software. There are auto code generators, but in terms of like actually designing software for specific client needs, that's a bit far off in the future, at least.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, and there's always the issue that if you want to think about things really cynically, I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a problem that needs solving and that problem requires some sort of intelligence or, well, general intelligence or problem solving capabilities, and there's always going to be places in the world where you can find like, or will probably always be places in the world where you'll be able to find, say, cheap human labor, and in which case those jobs probably won't be taken over by AI and ML because sometimes it just might be cheaper to like have a physical human doing the job and pay them peanuts compared to investing into a multi-million dollar set of robotics loaded up with the newest AI and ML models. But
Yeah, actually, good
that,
point. Yeah,
yeah, that's more in the field of jobs that require like interaction with the physical world. There are also plenty of jobs that are, for example, analyst jobs that tend to have to do with looking into data and such. And even those jobs, like such as data analysis jobs, some people argue that AI and ML can do them in the future. And I mean that might be true now, but as it currently stands, I think I mentioned about how data often comes in forms that aren't always easily read, or in forms that aren't very clean, or in forms that need a lot of context behind them, and that generally requires a human touch. In the future, in the near future, I'd say that AI and ML and robotics in general, they definitely destroy jobs, such as how the car destroyed, I don't know, the horse carriage industry, but they'll also create many more, and humans will learn how to use them to augment the current jobs that they do.
right. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. I guess moving on to the more fun questions. Sort of. Do you think that AI could rule the world? Like we've all heard of those like sci-fi situations and
Like
whatnot.
Skynet or
Yeah, yeah.
Skynet. It's a it's a very broad question. Could AI rule the world? I mean, it kind of depends. What do you mean by rule the world?
Like,
Function as some sort of pseudo government that allocates the resources where it need to be, creates policies in general, or just straight up dictatorial? What would you
probably
mean by rule
dictatorial.
dictatorial? Honestly, I'd say it's more likely that AI would destroy the world before it could rule it. Destroying the world's a lot easier. So,
That's
uh,
true.
I,
That's true.
I'd honestly I can't really give an opinion either way.
I see.
Just
Um,
yeah,
okay.
unless you count like a government made entirely out of synthetic humans as AI and ML ruling the world. Aside from that, I can't really say either way. It's a lot more believable to think about an AI or ML or robotics weapon that gets out of control and launches some sort of apocalyptic scenario. That seems a lot more likely, though.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is more easy to destroy the world than um rule it. Last question, I guess, since we're running out of time. Would you theoretically, if an AI robot woman asked you out, would you give her a chance?
Have you ever seen the movie She Her? I think it's called.
No.
I think the premise was essentially that where a man falls in love with a AI robot. Or have you seen the movie Ex Machina?
Also no.
No, that's also the same premise. Uh, how advanced are you saying that? How advanced are you saying that this AI or ML model would be? This AI or ML woman?
How advanced?
Yeah, like, are you talking about an actual straight up synthetic human being or a glorified
Uh,
chatbot?
I guess mostly, yeah, mostly actual synthetic,
Actual synthetic.
except you can still sort of tell that it's an AI. But other than that, like it's very human. Like it's meant
Ah,
to imitate humans very well.
I had to say no because simply because as a software engineer that does software engineering and also works on various AI and ML models, I really see AI and ML and robotics in general as tools for humans to use. And I could I I could never get over that fact. Maybe in the future, like 50 years from now, when I'm really old, and it'd be like some new 20-year-olds calling me some sort of racist against robots or whatever. But in my view, AI and ML models and robotics are always meant to be tools for humans
Mm.
to solve problems. So I'd have to say no. But that's just my humble opinion.
Yeah, I completely understand. I feel like most people also would have some sort of trouble with actually dating an AI. But maybe that'll change.
Perhaps if you grew up with knowing nothing but those incredibly realistic synthetic humans, you'd see them as people. But as someone who's worked deep into the guts of code and AI and ML models and has seen what they can do, it's just you can never really get over it. You don't,
Yeah,
yeah, it's you don't want to know what goes into making a sausage, essentially.
I like that analogy. Um, okay. Yeah, I think we're done here. Thanks a lot for giving me the time to do this and
Yeah, sure. Sorry if a lot of my answers were kind of rambling in general. I'm just
no,
giving my opinions off the thought, like off the top of my head.
yeah, that's good. That's good. Um, yeah, okay. Good luck with everything.
Thanks.
I definitely learned a lot. And yeah, thanks again. Goodbye.
Thanks. You, good luck to you too.
Thanks.